Hello and welcome to episode 67 of MMO Weekly, presented as always by Chitty's Cheesesteaks. I'm your host, Sal Manzo, along with my co-host and MMO executive editor, Mike Mayer. And Mike, Shohei Ohtani can buy a lot of hot dogs at Dodgers Stadium, about $700 million worth. Obviously, the big fish has landed. He signed with the Dodgers. We'll get into just everything that the implications of this, from the fact that the Mets never heard from him to the fact that, the Dodgers go from the premier team in the National League to being even more of the premier team in the National League. But besides the obvious, the contract itself and everything else, I just want to get your initial thoughts to Ohtani going to LA, or I should say staying in LA.
Well, yeah, and you said 700 million, but it's really only 460 million, which is obviously a part of this whole thing. Um, yeah, that's where I thought Ohtani was going to go all along, and I mean, really, I think that's where most people thought he was going to go. That's kind of been the talk for 2 or 3 years when he hit free agency, that it was going to be the Dodgers. Um, I think it was a bit of a surprise that like the Blue Jays were a finalist. I think that was certainly a surprise. I think it might be a little bit of a surprise that the Mets and Yankees weren't really all that involved. But we found out that that may have been because he told them that he didn't want to go to New York. There's one report out there suggesting that. If you put two and two together, it kind of makes sense to the fact that two of the top spending teams in the league, with the Yankees and Mets, weren't really involved all that much. Look, we know Cohen um, likes Ohtani. He likes the idea of Ohtani. He knows the business end of what Ohtani brings. Um, I think that had the Mets been given that kind of green light or whatever from Ohtani's people, that I think they certainly would have been more involved. And I have to imagine they could have matched a similar offer. In the end, 10 years, 460 million, which is what the deal really ends up doing, isn't all that crazy. 700 million, when everyone heard it for the first time, like, holy crap. And then we kind of get more of the details, and the 460 is really, yeah, that sounds about right, really. That's not even that much more than what Scherzer and Verlander got at per year value. It's only a couple million more.
Sure.
And so it's really not all that crazy in the end. Obviously, how it broke or didn't break for a couple of days,
Mm-hmm.
and all of that stuff adds to it. Finding out exactly what the contract is adds to it. That he's only getting 2 million actually per year when he's playing, and the 68 million when he's not playing for the 10 years after. Yeah, I think so. From a purely Mets standpoint, I
Mm-hmm.
think you obviously have to be disappointed to some degree, because when you have the richest owner in baseball, you hope to at least have a chance to get the best player in baseball.
Sure.
For whatever reason, that didn't work out, and now the Mets kind of have to adjust and hope that they can get the next Japanese star and Yamamoto, and hopefully they can get him to come to the Mets. So, which I'm sure we'll talk about at great lengths. But yeah, there's just a lot going on between kind of the end of the winter meetings and the end of that week. And like I said, we had a lot of bad reporting from
Sure.
multiple outlets that confused people even more. And I kind of feel bad for the fans of the Blue Jays, right? They were in on Ohtani, they were in on Soto, didn't get
Mm-hmm.
either of those
Mm-hmm.
guys. For a short period there, they thought they got Ohtani. And so I think the biggest losers of this entire thing is probably the Blue Jays fans.
Yeah, I mean, and poor Robert from Shark Tank, he was just trying to take a flight from LA back to Toronto for his family or whatever, and then it turned into this whole thing. But no, I mean, there's obviously a ton of layers to this. Also, I know it got reported today that there is an opt out in Shohei's deal that basically, if the owner of the Dodgers and the Dodgers' current president, if either of them kind of lose their positions or kind of bow out, then he's able to invoke an opt out there, which I find pretty interesting. I guess obviously he wants the people that signed them to his big deal to be there and all that. So that's interesting. And then another tidbit to all this, right? We talk about like, there seemingly was no interest really and no talking between Ohtani's camp and either the New York teams or anything like that. And, the reports that supposedly, he could see himself playing here. To that point, and, I don't know how much this means or whatever. Tomorrow being Thursday, Shohei Ohtani will have his press conference with the Dodgers, right? That seemingly will be the first time that Shohei has talked to the media since August 18th. And in that time, he has had Tommy John surgery and won the American League MVP. And no one has heard from him in like 5 months. Now, again, I know I don't know how much of the cultural difference kind of plays into that. I'm not sure. And that's something I think that is definitely an interesting point to that, because obviously I think we don't really think about that as much as Americans. But I would imagine that if the scenario of playing in New York, someone like Francisco Lindor, who's making $340 million, Aaron Judge, who's making $360 million, they speak to the media every night, whether they go 4 for 4 or 0 for 4. I can't imagine players here in New York would go for that kind of bubble that Ohtani's kind of put himself in. And again, I'm not knocking it either way. I just don't really see how that could have worked in New York, good or bad. But obviously, he gets what he wants. He doesn't have to move. He gets to stay in LA. He's on the best team, probably, definitely in the national top 2 in the National League, and has been one of the standard really for baseball the last 15 years. Obviously not a lot of winning, but regular season wise, just consistently going to the playoffs and whatnot. So it's a win-win. I think the Dodgers are going to recoup a ton of money from this between the international deals and everything else. So it's very interesting. It's also, I guess, from a Mets standpoint, nice that now that this big fish kind of fell, it seems like everything else will now fall into the place, especially with Yamamoto, which we know also we'll get into, that the Dodgers have obviously talking to him. Him and Ohtani are, friends from back in Japan. It's just wild talking about Yamamoto now. Just the money, it seems like every time we talk, his price tag goes up and up and up. But I guess I just want to get your thoughts on kind of the latest from him. It sounds like the Mets are in the top 2 or 3 teams there, but obviously, not even like Ohtani, there's really only a couple teams in. But as far as Yamamoto, there's a ton of teams that are really going to want him to pay top dollar. So I'm just wondering kind of what you've heard there on the Yamamoto sweepstakes latest.
Well, and yeah, I mean, you mentioned Ohtani hasn't talked as a Dodger yet, and he already did something for the Dodgers, right? Before he was announced, he was part of their pitch on Tuesday to Yamamoto with Mookie Betts and Freddie Freeman. That's a pretty good trio to roll out. Obviously, like you said, Ohtani does know Yamamoto. They've played against each other. They've played with each other internationally. Yeah, I think we kind of talked about it, is that the price tag has continued to go up. And when I was at the winter meetings in Nashville, I was on a video on a video that was predicting exactly how much we thought Yamamoto was going to go, where he was going to go. And I predicted that he would go to the Mets for 8 years and 285 million. And I remember seeing some of the immediate comments that were making fun of me for saying there's no way that he's going to get 285 million. Well, now a lot of the chatter is that he could potentially break Garrett Cole's record,
right,
of 324 million. That kind of seems like the expectation, that he's going to get 10 years, 330 million, or something in that range. And that seems like it's possible. I mean, like you said, Cohen flew to Japan to see him. He's met with the Yankees now. He's met with the Dodgers. He's met with the Giants. And John Heyman reported today that he's going to meet with the Red Sox, Phillies, and Blue Jays still. So you pretty much have every large market team in baseball vying for this guy. Mets and Yankees obviously have, well, the Yankees got Soto, but they certainly need some pitching. The Mets have missed out on all the big pieces so far. the Giants had until they signed Jung Ho Lee.
Mm-hmm.
The Dodgers obviously have the money available because of how they structured Ohtani's deal. The Red Sox really haven't done a ton yet. The Blue Jays, just like we are talking about, missed out on those two big guys,
Yep.
and the Phillies are always willing to spend. I mean, I think that kind of gets underlooked at their willingness to give some big deals. So, yeah, I think when you get these 7 teams involved in a player that is obviously seen as above whatever else is available, the Blake Schnells, the Jordan Montgomerys,
Sure.
those type of pitchers, he's clearly seen as the better pitcher that they want to get. A lot to do with being only 25, like we've
Right.
talked about a lot. Yeah, I don't think it's crazy to think about that he could get 10 years, 330 million. And I do think the Mets are going to be serious here. I think we've talked about it a lot. The Mets like him a lot. The Mets
Sure.
also know that they need a starting pitcher and they need
Right.
a front end starting pitcher.
Right.
And they just, the rotation right now is still Kodai Senga, Jose Quintana,
Mm-hmm.
Luis Severino, and then kind of who knows? And I mean,
Right.
Severino's obviously a question mark, and Quintana only pitched half a season last year, or a little
Sure.
over half a season. So there's significant questions in the Mets rotation, not only in the short term but in the long term, because Quintana's going to be a free agent after next year. So they have huge holes to fill in that rotation, and um, guys like this don't hit the market. So I
Sure.
think
Sure.
that the Mets are going to be aggressive here. I think they feel comfortable in Yamamoto's skill set, how it's going to translate to the big leagues.
Right.
Obviously, Stearns is new and wasn't here when Senge was here, but Jeremy Hefner was. There's a lot of
Right.
people still in the organization that helped get Sangla acclimated to the big leagues. So I think they feel very comfortable in their ability to get the best out of Yamamoto and see him as an ace, and that's what they're looking at. So I think the Mets are going to be aggressive here, and I look the Dodgers are going to be too, which
Right. Sure.
obviously isn't great news for the Mets, and obviously I think if you're just picking if Yamamoto comes down to two offers and he wants to go to the better team, because of two similar offers, I that's going to be tough for the Mets to
Sure.
match with the
Sure.
Dodgers. The Dodgers clearly have the better team on paper than the Mets, and that's tough to match up with. And so we'll see how it plays out. I have to imagine it sounds like he's probably going to do this week, and then maybe we start to get some more or closer to an answer next week about exactly where he's going to land. He's been pretty meticulous about how he's doing this. And look, this is a huge decision for
Right.
a guy to
Right.
come to the big leagues for his first time, sign his first contract, and if it ends up being a 10-year it could be his first and only contract in the
Sure.
big leagues for obviously significant money. He might set the pitching record. So um, it makes sense for him to kind of take his time with all this. And like I said, just to kind of wrap it up on my end, I do think that the Mets are going to be one of the, if they don't sign him, I think they're at least going to be one of those last two or three teams.
Yeah, absolutely. I think money is not going to be the issue here. I've been saying I think it's going to come down to his preference. And another thing I think that's interesting now is you look at this Ohtani contract and the way they structured it. I would imagine someone like Steve Cohen now sees that and says, "Wow, I can now use my money to my advantage once again." Because what now at this point doesn't make him say to Yamamoto, "I'll give you a 10-year, $400 million contract, and I'll backload 300 of it." And he's one of the few owners in baseball that can say, "Oh, I have to pay you $300 million out of pocket in 10 years? No problem. I can do that. That's great." So I wonder how much seeing that deal now will motivate them, because obviously we know they really want the player. And again, you see what the Dodgers did with Ohtani. The Yankees made the big trade for Soto. I would imagine Cohen and the Mets want to do their own splash for this offseason. So I think at the end of the day, and again, I know there's a lot of suitors, I think they're going to give more than top dollar, and I would imagine they're going to not to quote the Godfather, make an offer they can't refuse. It's just wild to me that we're talking about this kind of price tag for someone that's never pitched a day in the majors before, and we're talking about ace upside. Again, I can't, if I'm paying you Garrett Cole money, you got to be Garrett Cole. You have to be an ace. There's no two with an upside. It's I'm paying you to be a horse. I'm paying you to be the frontline starter, and hopefully, with his stuff and his age for what it is, hopefully it all translates. It's just it's really interesting just to see like how much this keeps growing and growing and growing, and if he'll be able to, I guess, handle that that kind of huge contract once he gets here, but that remains to be seen. I guess we should pivot now to more unfortunate news involving Ronny Mauricio. Obviously, the other night he was playing in the Winter League and he tore his ACL running on the Bates pass. Huge blow for the Mets, especially for me at third base. I mean, I think that Stearns kind of alluded to it, and it seemed like they were going to let the young guys kind of duke it out there at third. And it seemed like a lot of people, including myself, were high on him, kind of hopefully winning that job out of spring and seeing what he had. But huge blow for the Mets kind of offseason plans. And I'm just kind of wondering what you think they'll try and do now to pivot. If you think they're going to try and now go outside the organization, bring in a veteran to maybe possibly platoon with Beatty or push him outright for the starting job. I'm just curious if you've heard anything and just kind of your thoughts there with, the Mauricio news now.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, obviously pretty unfortunate. We don't know the extent of it quite or the recovery time yet because it depend. They got to go in there, and it's one of
Sure.
those things that kind of depends on what they have to do, the extent of what they have to do when they get in there. But there's obviously a chance that he will play almost no time in the big leagues next year.
Right.
It's very possible. And Stearns just said last week that third base was set and they weren't getting anyone outside the organization because of Beatty and Mauricio, which made sense to feel comfortable enough since you have both of those guys.
Mm-hmm.
Now you don't. Now you just have Beatty, and you have the question marks of how Beatty looked this year. And you have also less depth on the infield in general because Mauricio can play shortstop. He can play
Sure.
second base, too. The Mets have toyed with him in the outfield a little bit too. So I mean, it's not just a potential starting third baseman at the top end of what they're looking for on the bottom end. It was a guy who was going to provide depth and be a power bat. So I think the Mets haven't said much publicly, privately, any of that. So I think, but you'd have to imagine that this changes their thought process.
Sure.
They can't go from hoping one of those two guys battle it out to just giving full reins to Beatty and just having full confidence in him. Obviously, you would love for him to be that piece, but you need some insurance there. And I know Justin Turner is a name that we've mentioned a bunch of times on the podcast. We've written about him a bunch on the website. I tweeted about him a bunch just because it just makes so much sense,
Sure.
and not because he's a former Met. It makes sense because they need offense. He's still a good offensive player. They could certainly use a veteran bat, a guy that can also DH, which he can do, and then a guy who can back up third. He's not great defensively there at this point in his career, but he obviously knows how to play third base. He's got a ton of experience there. And after him and before him, there isn't really much. Like Matt Chapman is
Right.
the other
You're not
name.
going to sign. You're not going to overpay
And
for Matt Chapman.
yeah, and the Mets are not spending $100 million on Matt Chapman.
Right.
It's just not going to happen. And then after him, you have guys like IKF, who's a utility guy, Urshela, who's had a couple of down years after a good year with the Yankees. There's a couple of other guys that can play third base, but it's mostly after Turner. It's mostly kind of utility type guys.
Sure. Sure.
So, I mean, you got other veterans like Longoria, but I mean, he's definitely at the very end of his career and didn't have the season that Turner did. So you have to wonder exactly what the Mets do. They're kind of in a predicament now because they're just no one's really well. Candelario signed from this market, but I doubt the Mets would have been in that type of market anyway. But there really isn't a ton of options there. I mean, the Mets could certainly try to look into the trade market, but then you're giving up money and an asset
Right.
for a position that you thought you were set at. And as we've mentioned a lot on the podcast, Stearns has a lot to do this offseason, and
Yeah.
they really haven't done a ton to this point. I
Right.
mean, they've
Right.
certainly shored up like the AAA or 4A depth. That's something that they've done a good job at.
Yep.
And we can talk about that because today they signed Trace Thompson, an outfielder with a little bit of pop. But as the major league roster kind of stands, they've the biggest contract they've given out is 1 year's 13 million to Luis Severino,
Yep.
and after that it's 1 year's 2 million to Jorge Lopez and Joey Wendell.
Mm-hmm.
So depth, yeah, just pretty much the exact definition of depth. These guys are not going to be counted on to play in big roles if
Sure.
they have career or close to career years like they've had before. Wendell had a couple of really good years with the Rays,
Mm-hmm.
and Lopez was really good in 2022. Then you'll be super happy about those deals. But the reality is the Mets still need two starters. Um, you would probably like to get a setup man.
Right.
You probably need a starting outfielder. Stearns mentioned that,
Mm-hmm.
and they haven't added even a backup outfielder yet, which we've heard more about that market with like Michael Taylor
Mm-hmm.
and potential trade for Manuel Margot and just different names that Kevin Kiermaier. But they really need a starting outfielder, which
Yeah.
is something that's kind of been overlooked. And they could probably use a DH too, like someone who can play full time DH. So to bring this all back, those are all the things that Stearns have to worry about and has to fill. And now he really needs to make sure that he gets insurance at third base,
Right.
which is important. Look, I like Beatty. I still have confidence in that Beatty is going to be a big leaguer. I think it just takes a little bit longer for some guys. Um, and I think he's the type of guy that's still going to hit at the big league level. But you need, if you're going to be a playoff contender, which the Mets certainly want to be next year, you have to have that insurance that a guy like Justin Turner brings.
Yeah, I mean, to me at this point now, Turner seems like the best option as far as for third base. Can platoon with Beatty, filling at DH when you need. It's just makes the most sense at this point now with what happened with Mauricio. And then outside of him, I think as far as DH goes, I think JD Martinez is still a good fit there to be your full time DH. I think that that's something that obviously we've talked about has lacked the last few years. They've really haven't put an emphasis on having a thumper at DH, someone to protect Alonso, etc. So I think that would work. And as far as the outfield, as far as you're talking about, I mean, someone like Jock Peterson would be a great fit. Um, at least as I think, you bring you power, can play decent outfield. He's currently still a free agent. I don't think anybody signed him yet. So that would be kind of nice to round them out in the outfield there because you don't know what the heck you're getting with Starling Marte at this point. And then as far as the pitching goes, you mentioned it. I mean, I think that's what's going to be a 2-year plan here. I just don't know how they're going to be able to fill all this in 1 year. I would imagine that the emphasis being on Yamamoto to head the rotation, and then filling in those back end pieces on the rotation. But outside of a setup man, which obviously they need, I would assume the rest of the bullpen, at least, that's going to have to be Stearns kind of using his magic, right? Like he did in Milwaukee, finding guys like Hader, finding guys like Devin Williams, developing them. So, some of this is probably going to have to go on Stearns using that magic eye of his. So it'll be interesting to see how they're able to kind of plug and play there. But like you said, it's, there's a lot of spots to fill with not a ton of quality options out there right now, at least on the free agent market for them.
Yeah, I mean, we knew coming into it outside of kind of a top heavy pitching market, starting pitching market, um, that there just wasn't a ton of options out
Mm-hmm.
there on mostly on the position player side that aren't DH types. Like
Yeah,
the DH types is a fairly good market when you got Turner, Martinez, Soler that we didn't talk about.
sure.
But I mean, the rest of position play, the outfield, you have Cody Bellinger, really, who's likely going to get, to me, kind of a crazy deal coming off a good season, a very
Yeah,
good
yeah.
season, but he prior to that was very bad for two
Mm-hmm.
years.
Mm-hmm.
So there's certainly some risk there, and a lot of risk because he's got the market cornered. There's no other outfielders really
Yeah.
starting caliber like him, so he's really got that cornered. And there isn't because Jung Hoo Lee got 6 years, 113 million from the Giants, which so Major League Trade Rumors, who we've mentioned on the podcast
Mm-hmm.
many
Mm-hmm.
times, do their top 50 prediction, free agent prediction, and they're very good at what they do. They've been
Right.
doing this for a long time.
Sure.
They get very close on deals. They've absolutely nailed a couple of deals so far this offseason. They're very close on Eduardo Rodriguez. They're off by like 2 million. Um, they're very close in what they do. And Jung Hoo Lee, they had pegged at 5 years, 50 million,
Wow.
and the Giants gave him 6 years, 113 million.
Yep.
And look, we know that the Giants missed out on Aaron Judge.
Yep.
Um, it came out that they were very serious about Ohtani. They made it sound like they were just willing to match whatever the Dodgers were going to do,
Yep.
and they were sick of missing out on people.
Yeah.
And they apparently just decided to throw a crazy number at Lee, and that's what they did, and they signed him. I think Lee is going to be a fine outfielder that gets on base. We've talked about him. I thought he was a fit for the Mets. I don't think he's a fit for literally any other team at that price tag.
Sure. Sure.
It it very much feels like a bidding against themselves situation where the Giants just threw a crazy number out there to
Right.
make sure that they got the guy that they wanted after Ohtani and other options had gone elsewhere. Um, so I know when I posted about it and Mets fans kind of saw the news, some of them were really kind of freaking out because he had signed. But I just Cohen has his money, but there has to be a limit to what you're doing,
Yep.
and I don't think that giving Lee that type of contract is a wise baseball move. Look, maybe Lee makes us all look silly, and he's
Right.
great for the Giants, but there isn't a situation. That's not a situation where I think Stearns or Cohen is to blame. Um, so now, again, the Mets kind of have to regroup because that was one of the only starting outfielders on the market. Regardless of whether it was a crazy deal or not, that's another guy that's off the market in a bear market like we've talked about. Teoscar Hernandez is someone that we haven't talked about, but probably is one of the best options there is.
Sure.
Um, Not a great fielder, but
Right.
outside of last year, he's been very good offensively. So maybe that's a guy that kind of turned their focus to. Obviously, has has a fair amount of power, which the Mets need. Um, but that's what they're going to have to do is they're going to have to kind of get into these secondary and third markets for these different um, outfield in this particular, and they might have to for the pitcher too. I mean, like we said, even if they do get Yamamoto, they still need another starter, which
Right.
is why they talked to, before he signed with the Royals, the Mets did talk to Seth Lugo,
Mm-hmm.
which I found interesting because last offseason they didn't talk to him at all. And this offseason they had at least called him and checked in to see where his market was at. And it sounds like by the time they had checked in, he had already had a very good offer from the Royals, which he ended up taking 3 years,
Sure.
45 million. But
Well.
at least we know that the Mets are thinking about that type of market because we know they've been involved in Montgomery. Um, I've talked to folks that they've certainly have interest in Snell if they miss out on Yamamoto because let's face it, Snell is the reigning NL Cy Young winner. At some point, someone is going to sign him, and it's going to be an interesting deal to see what happens. I know the Mets have talked about a shorter term deal with a high
Yep.
AAV
Yep.
because they don't want to they'd rather take that risk in a shorter term with
Yep.
Snell than spreading it over 10 years with, say, like a Yamamoto. So that's something I would look for if the Mets do miss out on Yamamoto is to see how the Mets pivot to Snell and kind of see how that would potentially be structured. I would expect it to be short term with a high AAV. And yeah, I mean, I don't look. You see it on Mets Twitter when like today when Trace Thompson, that deal was announced, and all the other minor league deals they've done. You can see that Mets fans are getting frustrated and a little impatient, and it's tough to blame them, right? Like Shohei Ohtani, the best player in baseball, was available, went somewhere else. Juan Soto was available, went somewhere else. There's been Eduardo Rodriguez was available, went somewhere else. There's been a couple of other pitchers that have signed, and like we mentioned, Luis Severino is the biggest deal that the Mets have signed. I would say that there's still the pieces there. I still think there's an opportunity for the Mets to have a really good offseason. They signed Yamamoto and a starter, and Teoscar Hernandez, and Justin Turner,
Mm-hmm.
and David Robertson. We're just throwing names out here, but if they get, say, like those five guys, I think that's a pretty good offseason with some
Sure.
other depth pieces mixed in. So I think it's definitely possible for the Mets to still have a strong offseason. It's still relatively early as the offseason goes, and there's still some trade pieces that we know
Mm-hmm.
potentially might be
Mm-hmm.
available that haven't been moved. I know Tyler Glasnow to the Dodgers has been discussed, but
Mm-hmm.
that we haven't got anything final on that yet. So between that and other guys that have been mentioned, Dylan Cease still hasn't been traded. There's a couple of other arms that have been mentioned. So it'll be interesting to see if that's kind of where Stearns adjusts to for some of these positions that they need.
Yeah, and I mean, like you said, right? I know on the surface, a lot of these moves are making Mets fans frustrated, but the Mets had the most to fill on any 40-man roster in the sport. They cut 16 guys before all this. So, I see what Stearns is doing. He's filling in, like you talked about, that AAA, quadruple A depth, like they're doing, which is important. You have to have it. And I think, with Ohtani, lingering around, people waiting for to see what everyone else is going to do. But now that he landed, I would imagine now that the Yamamotos and these bigger fish are going to, go soon. And the Mets are going to be in on, like you said, for Yamamoto. It's just going to come down to preference. And I understand if fans are maybe frustrated about Ohtani or a Soto. The only thing I would say is to that is the Mets are not one piece away. This wasn't this isn't a team that was just one bat away or one pitcher away. This is clearly probably a 2-year plan. It seems like, of a reshuffle, whatever you want to call it. So I can't. And again, it sounded like Ohtani didn't want any party here anyway. So, if a player doesn't want interest in the organization or the city, there's nothing you could do about that, no matter how much money. But as far as Soto goes, I think the Mets probably looked at this as someone that's going to be a free agent next year. If he ends up signing with the Yankees long term during the year, so be it. But with his, who his agent is and everything else, he'll probably end up hit free agency. So they probably think they could sign him there, and they probably also you just replenished the farm system from last year. You took advantage of a seller's market like we talked about. You don't want to not throw it all away, but use it all up then on especially in a rental player when you still have to sign Pete Alonso. There's a lot that goes on there. I think that, on the surface fans can get mad at, but I think you got to look at it with a little deeper lens and understand why they did what they did.
Well, and to jump in here, Sal, I think that's a really good point about Soto too. I mean, if you watch this press conference, it definitely sounds like he's probably going to hit free agency.
Yep.
Um, and let the Mets build up this
Right.
offseason, get a Yamamoto,
Yep.
some of the other names that we've mentioned, and have kind of a better core and a better team depth wise, deep wise, to add that big piece like Soto as a free agent next year.
Sure.
Um, I certainly I wouldn't have been adverse to them getting Soto, but it does make sense from a standpoint of, yes, they are a couple more pieces away than maybe
Mm-hmm.
some of these other teams that were involved. And so get some of those other pieces, and then next year when he's a free agent, I know from talking to people that Steve Cohen certainly likes Juan Soto,
Sure.
and
Sure.
that's a type of player that he's going to covet, and so they're certainly going to be involved, assuming he's available. And you're that makes a lot of sense what you were saying. So yeah, it's just those pieces are gonna. The Mets are still gonna get the needed pieces,
Sure.
but the frustration is kind of, it makes sense too, um, from just like a fan standpoint, where you certainly want your team to get the better players when they're available. And I think I think it was in an article by Ken Rosenthal on the
Hmm.
Athletic, and he said a good point because Ohtani had signed, Soto had been traded, and that executive said, I can't remember exactly how he said it, but he basically said, if the Mets don't sign Yamamoto, what's the point even having all of that money?
Right.
Like, this is the time, this is that particular player, the particular fit to just be like, what's your best offer that you have right now? I'm going to throw 25 million on top of that. Whatever the number is, this feels like the time where the Mets and Steve Cohen need to do that.
Yeah, and like I said, with the way the Otani contract worked out now, Steve Cohen must be licking his chops and saying, if I could, backload a contract like that and just pay out of pocket, he's one of the few people who can do it. So hopefully he can use that to his advantage. Um, and I was good. My other point I was going to make too, to what you were saying, it still is early in the off season. So I think there's a lot of time for the Mets to have, and I agree with you, to have a quality off season and bring in some good players. It's just going to see really I guess what Stern's kind of vision is and what he's looking to really, lock up before the season starts. Like I said, I think we're in agreement that pitching is probably going to be the premium at this point because they have no choice. And then fill in veterans, within the lineup as it goes. But, we'll see. I think if you can shoot for 85 wins and if you're in it at the deadline, you can add, maybe a third baseman if you don't go at that route this winter now, whatever. But it'll be interesting. I think if they can really sew up the pitching part, at least the staff, and then hopefully hit on a couple of guys in the bullpen. Stearns can find some kind of diamonds in the rough. Then that's a good it's a good start. But next year's offseason between Soto probably going to become a free agent, and then whatever happens with Alonso, if they don't, it seems like they're probably going to let him play out his walk year, and then he'll be hit the free agent market next year. It should be next year especially, you know pretty busy here in Queens, I would think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like you said, this it's obviously important for Stearns to kind of set his ground this offseason because of what the Mets need. But you've mentioned it multiple times that this is a multi-year kind of build-up. Next year is going to be an important offseason too, with Soto potentially available, Alonso potentially a free agent, and some other holes because they just can't fill them all this offseason. So this is really a kind of a 2 year thing to get started. And that's not to say that the Mets aren't going to be competitive next year,
Sure.
like you said, and a lot of people have talked about now. It's get to a position at the deadline where you're in the hunt,
Yep.
where you're in the wild card hunt, make a couple of moves, and then get to the playoffs. We've seen it to this point now that we just know that it's a crapshoot. I mean,
Yep.
you've got a team like the Dodgers getting in and losing, and they're arguably the best team on paper, but
Right.
you've got other teams getting in through the wild card and making it to the World Series.
Yep.
And it's just about being right at the best time. So get in there and see what you can do. And I think that's kind of where the Mets have to kind of just build this up. And
Yeah.
look, they want to be there for a long time. So it's not, there's no way you can just change it overnight. Stearns has a lot to do. Um, from the player standpoint that we've talked about a lot, but there's just a lot of stuff within the organization
Yep.
that's going to
Yep.
change too. So this is going to be getting to the point is just preaching kind of patience.
Sure.
This isn't this just isn't something that can be fixed
Yeah.
overnight or even this off season. This is going to be something that Stearns has to work at for a couple of years, and hopefully, still in that time, like we're talking about, the Mets are able to squeak into a wild card and be able to see if they can win a series or two that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And last note on Juan Soto, he'll be 26 next year when if he hits free agency. So still nice and young. People forget he came up in the big leagues at 19. It feels like he's been here forever. So hopefully he gets acclimated to New York and then he's bails for the better borough. That's what I would do. But I don't want to tamper, so we'll let him have his fun in the Bronx for 1 year. But I think that's going to wrap everything up for this week, Mike. Obviously, a lot going on. Holidays coming up next week, but if anything happens, if Yamamoto signs anything else significant as far as within the Mets offseason, we'll be here to update you. But until then, as always, everybody, let's go Mets.